Hi everyone and welcome to today's video. Recently I was asked a question about Lamy nibs and my thoughts on the different variations of nibs that are available for the Safari and All-Star range. So what I thought I'd do a quick little video just showing a few of the nibs that I have in my collection in written sort of examples. So here's a little sheet I've done up using a mixture of Safaris and All-Stars using the range of nibs that I have. So we'll start at the finer end, and we have the Lamy Extra Fine, which is used here with Robert Oster Green Lime. Now, the finer the nib, obviously, the less ink it's going to put down on the page. So one thing you do get is you get less shading, and there's virtually very little chance of getting any sheen coming through. Now, this isn't a high sheening ink, but if you were even using Fire and Ice or Barrier Reef Blue, you still would struggle to see some of the sheen from this nib, which the fact that it puts down less ink is both a good thing and a bad thing depending on what you're using it for. If you're using thin paper or you've got particularly small handwriting, then this is a great nib for you. It is quite fine, and it's wet enough to allow the colour to be sort of nicely sort of saturated without it becoming sort of too dark. Now, when we move to the fine nib, we do start to see a little bit more shading and some of those sort of nice darker spots becoming more apparent. It's a slightly wetter nib. This is Mont Blanc Irish Green, so it's a nice shading ink to start with. But we do really get some beautiful shading, particularly on things like that crosshatch there and in some of the writing. This nib I still find fine enough to use on Leuchtturm paper without it becoming too dark on the ghosting on the page behind, and even with a strong ink like a Noodler's Liberty's Elysium or something like that, you still don't get a huge amount of sort of cut through coming through on the page behind. Once we move to the Lamy medium, here inked with Robert Oster River of Fire, you start to get a lot more shading and a lot more of the saturation. In fact, there are spots on this that are really quite dark, and this is quite a nice dark green ink, but these medium nibs are verging on getting quite wet, which I really like. I prefer a medium and a wet nib, but if you're using, once again, cheaper paper, this is where we start to get a little bit sort of problematic. And I used this ink because it is a sheening ink, and I just wanted to see exactly what we could get out of it. Now, this is Rhodia 80 gram paper, so it's treated and less absorbent than some sort of cheaper, lower quality paper. And there are spots where we start to get a little hint of the red coming through on this, and that's just with the plain Lamy medium nib. You see a little bit more of it once we move to the broad. Now, the Lamy broad, I find this particular nib, I don't know if this is the same across all the Lamy broads, but this particular one, it's quite wet. It lays down a lot of ink and allows for some really nice shading and sheen to start sort of coming through. For instance, when you use a nib like this with Emerald of Chivor or something like that, you get some really fantastic results. Now, these first four nibs are round nibs, so they are ground so that the up and down strokes and the cross strokes are the same width. So for everyday plain sort of standard writing, this is your sort of standard shape of nib. And once we get into the 1.1 and here the 1.5, now I don't have a 1.9, so I've only been able to go as far as the 1.5. But once you get into these nibs, where you get a bit of shape to the writing, with the down strokes being considerably thicker than the cross strokes. So I had the 1.1 on the Lamy Petrol. Now I really wish that they would do some of the black steel nibs for in the italic range, because I love the 1.1 Lamy nib, but when you've got this beautiful pen with the black trim and you have to put a silver nib on it, it's a little bit sort of anticlimactic, I guess you could say. But the nibs work really well. I like these ones for either broad or the 1.1 for when I do my ink reviews, because they put down a nice amount of ink. I find the 1.1 brings out the shading really, really well. And I think that's quite clear here with the Lamy Petrol ink that I've got in it. You've got some really great darker spots, and then a nice amount of ink for the saturation and the colour to be seen. Now, a 1.1 Lamy isn't so strikingly different in the ups and downs versus the crosses, but it's it's enough to give the writing a little bit of shape. We see the real variation when we get to the 1.5 in this collection. Here inked with Blackstone Barrier Reef Blue, which is a high sheening ink, and I'll put a close-up of some of that sheen on this writing just to show you just how that comes through. But this is quite a wet nib, and it really puts down quite a lot of ink. So you actually tend to get a little less shading on this nib than you do on the 1.1. The 1.1 seems to just put down a little bit less across the board, whereas 1.5 really lays it down thick, which is great. I think it's a beautiful nib to write with, and it does give quite beautiful shape to the writing. So as you can see, from the extra fine through to the 1.5, there's a huge variation in the nibs available on the Lamy pens, and what's great about them is that they're all interchangeable. So I can take a fine nib off my Neon Lime and put it on my Petrol or my All-Star, and it really doesn't matter what Lamy pen you have in this range, and also a couple of others. I think the Lamy Joy also uses these, and it means that you've got great variation at a much lower price. Instead of having to buy a whole new pen to get a 1.5 or a fine or whatever you might want to get, you can just buy the nib. And the nibs do vary in price, and depending on where you shop, of course, online and in stores, but they are widely available, and it's fun just to have a little collection of them, just so that you can be able to change and play with the inks with different saturations and different line variation and natural line variation. None of these are flexible, they're really rigid nibs. You can't really squeeze a lot of variation out of them at all, but they're really lovely nibs to write with. They're generally fairly well tuned. You get the odd one that has a bit of a baby's bottom or doesn't quite, isn't quite lined up, but for the most part they're nicely behaved nibs. And I really like the Lamy model anyway, the Safari or the All-Star. It's a nice size and shape for my hand and the way I write. So I really enjoy these nibs, and if you're looking at getting a pen and you think about a Lamy, try one out first, like go and hold one so that you can actually see how it feels in your hand. But with this amount of this variation of nibs available, and as the pens and the nibs are widely available, it's nice to be able to change and play around without sort of too much expense. So this was the Lamy nibs. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notifications button if you'd like to stay in touch with the videos that I produce. And please feel free to drop me a message if you've got any questions or anything you'd like me to sort of cover in one of my videos. If you've got any products you'd like me to look at, we'll see what we can do. In the meantime, enjoy your pens, enjoy writing, and I'll talk to you later.